anyway. Right, I think we are live, Chris. So welcome to Raptor Aid's page. Thank you very much for being the final of, I think we've done 24 Q&As over lockdown. So I really appreciate you taking some time out and capping her off. We've had a few friends of yours on it. We had, I've just mentioned off air that we had Steve Roberts on last. So, I'm good friends with Steve. Although I insulted him, but I'm quite good at insulting him because I said, thank you very much for coming on, Steve. I really appreciate it. And then I mentioned to people, oh, we've got someone really special on next week. And Steve was like, what Steve's like, he's like, oh, fantastic. What a way to welcome me, Jimmy. So yeah, I know him well.
He's a top bloke. He's a very, very knowledgeable birder. And did he show you his Philippines Eagles pictures?
Well, I was there. So I'm the man. I took him to the Philippines. So, yeah.
Not that I'm envious or anything. Not that I'm envious. Yeah. I've not seen Philippines Eagle. It's been up there on my list. And we did schedule a trip to go there a few years ago with the Philippines Eagle Foundation. And something to do with the Philippines Tourist Board, but unfortunately it fell apart because the nests in that particular year, this is going back about 8 years, I suppose, were not in particularly good places. I wanted to photograph them, so they weren't in particularly good places. But it's still, if we ever get traveling ever again, it's one of my destinations.
I'm very lucky. I was sat next to Steve when an adult female came over the top of the hide and alighted on the nest in front in the chick. But anyway, I won't make you any more jealous than that. So yeah,
amazing.
Been there. Right. Okay. So I normally start dead simple, and sorry if these are all questions you've answered probably a million times, but I always start the same. One of the things I always wanted to achieve with these Q&As was just for you to explain to people where it started yourself, where you found that love for the natural world, and where did it all begin for you?
Well, the natural world started really young. My parents say that I would be, crawling around the back garden in Southampton. We had a very small house there with a very small garden, and it was ladybirds and tadpoles and all those sorts of things that I could find. Violet ground beetles. I remember the smell of violet ground beetles. I always liked picking them up and sniffing them. They had a really pungent odor. I miss that. I don't see violet ground beetles anymore, and so it was there. And then I was fortunate. My parents and grandparents bought me books on birds for my sort of first and second birthdays. So I loved the pictures of the birds. Although birds weren't my first love, it was always things that I could capture and keep that I liked best. It was tadpoles in jam jars and caterpillars in jam jars, and then latterly reptiles in tanks. And birds were elusive. They flew away, and I didn't have any binoculars at a very young age, so I couldn't see them clearly. I love finding dead birds and picking them up and, being able to see them properly. I remember finding a dead starling at the bus stop and being absolutely entranced by the plumage. I took it home and snuck it into the bedroom and looked at it later. But I didn't get into birds until I was about 12. And my dad bought me the Heinzel, Parslow and Fitter field guide. And he bought some binoculars turned up from somewhere. I don't know where they turned up from, but anyway. And it was then that I got into birds. And I got into birds again through, I'd always be out looking for stuff. And I started finding birds' nests. So I got into nesting big time. And it was that got me into birds. And then I had a really good biology master who got me to do maps and map out all the nests and count the eggs and count the young and all that sort of stuff. And that was when I was, say, 12 or 13. But I was quite obsessive, so I'd latch on to one thing and then I'd read about that and think about that and absolutely nothing else. And then it would switch to something else. So I went through bats and otters, like all young people, dinosaurs. Well, although dinosaurs have never gone, I'm still massively into dinosaurs. And then, and birds sort of took over. The only thing was that I wanted to study birds when I went to university. That was my plan, but I got sort of wrapped up in a badger study, And so I ended up studying mammals at university. I did badgers and common shrews, and I did a little bit of sparrowhawks, and prior to that, kestrels. But yeah, so for that period of time, I spent most of my time with a head down the set rather than in the nest, as it were.
In the nest, so to speak. Funnily enough, one of the other things I was going to ask you next was about who was an inspiration, and you mentioned a teacher. I never had that growing up. My parents were very supportive, but I never had a teacher. And I'm talking to a few people doing this. A few people had that someone in school that managed to encourage them and steer them.
Yeah, I didn't have a great time, really. Yeah, I was okay up till I was about 12, actually, and then things started to sort of go quite wrong at school. It wasn't a great environment for me. I loved learning, I loved all of that. But I love learning the things that I was interested in, not the things that I wasn't interested in. That was a bit of a struggle. And so I wasn't an ideal pupil, and I didn't really like the school environment very much. But I was very fortunate. I had this biology teacher, young biology teacher called John Buckley, and he's a great naturalist. He's always been a great naturalist, and he was into barn owls, and we collected pellets and analysed all of those, and he taught me how to trap small mammals and all those sorts of things. He was a great sort of mentor. But the key thing that he did was he got me into keeping notes and then counting things. He got me into science a long time before most young people get into science, and that was enormously advantageous to me, because by the time I got to university, I'd published a couple of papers and things, which was precocious. But thanks to John, because of his encouragement, and that was great. And then when I got to university, I was fortunate again. I had some really good, tutors. Prior to that, another guy called Alec Faulkner, who steered me through sixth form college. I was warring with the world at that time. I was massively into punk rock, and the Asperger's wasn't doing me a world of good. So I was warring with the world. So Alec Faulkner got me through sixth form, and then I went to Southampton University. Rory Putman was my tutor. He was great. But I also had the great fortune to meet Ian Newton at the time at university. And that one Saturday afternoon was enormously formative for me. He was really, really kind to me when a lot of people weren't being very kind. And of course, he'd published loads of stuff that I'd read by then. Most importantly, How to Silence a Poodle. Nancy, thanks. Sorry. He published Population Ecology of Raptors, the Poyser book.
Yeah.
And I read it from cover to cover and then backwards and then upside down in the dark and everything. And I loved that book, and it was, along with Leslie Brown's New Naturalist, Birds of Prey. They were my two sort of love to reads, And when I met in Newton, I didn't know what he looked like. And I was giving a talk about a study of kestrels that I'd done when I was 17. So I was full on punk rock, and I'd gone to Oxford, the EGI conference, to do it. And to say that I stood out like a sore thumb would be an understatement of enormous magnitude. Anyway, I stood up, and much to the horror of some of the attendees, and I gave my talk. And when I finished, this man who had been sat in the front row, and I'd noticed had been paying, like quite detailed attention, leapt up and ran forward to shake my hand and said, what a great study. Well, that's really good. And did you think about doing this? And why didn't you do that? And all that sort of stuff. And it was Ian Newton. And I was like on cloud 29, the guy's a legend. And at that time, when I was getting quite a lot of grief, it was so, reassuring to know that if you had an intense interest in, at that time, it was birds of prey, science. It didn't matter what color your hair was, or what, whether you had a leather jacket with studs on, all that cut through for Ian. And he didn't give a damn. He was just interested in enthusiastic young students, and it was fantastic, man.
I've never met Ian, but he's one of the things I love about monitoring birds of prey is the people I get to meet and work with. So Steve Roberts, for instance, is he's a good friend now, and people like that out in the field is just a.
I work with two. I'm talking about Ian. I'm very fortunate that I work with Ruth Tingay and Mark Avery, and they are equally sort of legends in contemporary conservation for me, it's an enormous privilege to not only know them, but to be able to work with them. Obviously, I've known Mark for a long time, not as a partner, business partner, and sort of colleague, but for a long time whilst he was at the RSPB. Yeah. But I mean, I think that they represent, the formidable face of British conservation. They don't pull their punches. They're really clear thinking, intelligent people who are enormously dedicated and who think through everything they do. And they're remarkably, well informed, and they're just two great people. I love spending time with them again, and Mark's a mentor outside of that as well. There've been a number of sort of important decisions I've had to make, professional decisions, and he's my sort of go-to guru because I know I'm going to get a level-headed, sane, sensible, considered, and reasonable, rational, and good feedback from Mark. So I've made a number of sort of pertinent phone calls at the right moment to the right man, and I'm greatly indebted to that.
Oh, good. Well, it was a pleasure to talk to both Mark and Ruth, and Ruth. I got a lot of good feedback. Well, from both of them really, or from people tuning in. So you're a lucky man to have them in your corner. Okay, Birds of Prey. Going back to the youth, I have read your book. It was quite a while. Oh, have I listened to it on an audio book? I might have cheated. And
there is an audio book, yeah.
Yeah, I think I listened to it as an audio book because I tend to, when I'm doing boring jobs, I'll put an audio book on. Anyway, you had a Kestrel when you were younger. My background, for many years, was Captain Birds of Prey. And so, I've worked with them for years. I don't anymore. And so, how the Kestrel was a big part of your life at one point, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's again, an understatement. So basically, one afternoon after school, I went to a bloke called John Davis's house, and he lived above a shop at the Triangle, and he had an egg collection. And I was into the birds, and I was finding all the nests and all that sort of stuff. So I went, I didn't know him really well, but I went back after school to see his egg collection. And he had a kestrel's egg, and it was the most beautiful thing. Of all the eggs that he had in his collection, that one stood out. It was just that beautiful, rich russet color, all of those speckles. I can remember being there now and seeing that egg, and just falling absolutely in love with it. And that made me think, I've got to find some kestrel's nests, because I'd found a couple before that, but they'd had young, and I'd found a dead youngster beneath a nest, which I tried to mount taxidermy, but it didn't work because it was too young. The feathers were hadn't grown out of their sheaths. It makes it really difficult to mount them, certainly if you're an amateur. Anyway, so the following year I sort of set out to find kestrel nest, and I started I found 70 square kilometers between Southampton and Winchester, and I determined that I'd find every kestrel's nest in that area. And so I got on my bike, pretty much forgot about homework, got on my bike every day throughout the year, and cycled about and mapped them all, and climbed up to those that I could get to, most of them, and counted the eggs. And John came along, and we rung as many of the youngsters that we could get access to, and he was a ringer, and that was the sort of start of my love with birds of prey. And then the following year, sparrowhawks were not a bird that we saw much of here in the south of England in the 60s and 70s. They disappeared due to persecution and the pesticide thing. I mean, they were around, but you never, it was a real treat to see one. And then I found a sparrowhawk's nest quite close to home, and I go, oh my goodness, that was so exciting, And I remember climbing up, and again with John ringing those youngsters. It was amazing. And then I also met up with a guy called Colin Tubbs, and Colin Tubbs worked for, as it was then, the Nature Conservancy Council, now Natural England, and he was based at Lyndhurst, and he'd written a book called The Buzzard. Yeah. And so I met up with him, and that was when I was studying, badgers, and we'd mull over lots of honey buzzards and buzzard stuff. And again, it was a real privilege to be able to spend time talking to him. So birds of prey set in at that point, and following finding all the nests, I determined that this was at the brink of the point where initially it was all about stuff that I could keep, So I had to put it in a jar, I had to put it in a tank, I had to put it in a cage. And it was at that transition where I was beginning to realize that actually you could learn more about it if you just left it in the wild and watched it. But the kestrel came at that point. So I still wanted to sort of own one. And I went and got this kestrel from one of the nests that I'd found when I was doing my study. And I had it for that summer of 1975. And yeah, it was undoubtedly the best summer of my life. It was an extraordinary, relationship that I had with that bird. And, and I mean, I've loved kestrels and sparrowhawks ever since. Hold on just a sec. Sid. Try to garden for wildlife, and the dogs just flatten all your planting.
So yeah, 2 poodles for you. We talked a bit about the connection you get with birds because we had Helen McDonald on as well, author of H is for Hawk.
I know, yeah.
Before Steve, so obviously she goes into it in great detail in that book. Because are you still? Am I right in thinking, are you still president at the Hawk Conservancy? I haven't made.
Not actually, but I still have a great fondness for the Hawk Conservancy. I think they do, brilliant work in terms of their conservation, their education. It's a fantastic place. The standards of husbandry are outstanding, best I've ever seen. The falconers that they use and the displays that they do are absolutely, amazing. And so I'm a great fan of the Hawk Conservancy. And hopefully, I was going to be visiting this weekend, but now that the weather's not going to be great, I'll probably leave it. I was going to go and take some photos there.
Yeah, we've got that's another mutual friend, Ashley Smith. I get on well with Ashley. I tried to get him onto this, but unfortunately, during lockdown, his allegiances to the Hawk Conservancy were too strong, and so he was doing videos and stuff for them rather than me, which is, I understand, it's fair enough. So yeah. I mean, so what? Because I've still got friends. Oh, my internet's gone a bit dodgy then, sorry.
That's right.
I was just going to ask about a couple of friends have said on the run up to this, a few friends to me said, ask Chris how he feels about birds in captivity now then. And so, yeah, how do you feel about the birds in captivity and falconry and, yeah, that whole aspect? I mean,
I suppose it's like everything else, I like those sorts of things when they don't get too unregulated and commercialized, So, I mean, when I was into falconry, which I sort of pretty much gave up by the time I'd left university because I didn't have the time to look after the birds properly and therefore wouldn't keep them, then it was when they got into all that hybrid stuff, and I don't get the hybrid thing, I have to say. For me, I love life. And speciation is part of life. And of course, occasionally you might get hybrids between some of those animals, but that would be very rare. That's the point of speciation. The point is that they have found their niche and they found a way of, becoming an independent species. So twisting them all back and rolling them all in together, I never got that. And then obviously now we have issues where some of the birds are worth enormous sums of money. And recently, Mark, Ruth and I, while Justice, were looking at a site in Scotland where people were essentially hacking Gaia falcons. And they were turning out large numbers of Gaia falcons in one small space under license. And our question was with SNH. And the question is, why are you giving permission for this one site to have so many of these top of the food chain predators roaming around? And it's all about money because those birds are worth a lot of money and they're going overseas. This year, licenses, as you will know, were granted by Natural England to take peregrines from the nest in the UK. Yeah. I mean, this is again just about money. I'm not a fan, frankly. We breed peregrines in captivity. They've had some. There was a little bird they had. It had a bit of lana in it because it had this little rusty mark around the back of its head, which didn't appeal to me. But it was called Lark, and they had it at the Hawk Conservancy, and it was one of their display birds, a little tearsel. I've never seen anything like that bird flying to the lure. I mean, it was relentless. It would stoop, and it did every stoop with venom and energy. It wasn't messing around. It was one of the most exciting birds, ever. It was bred in captivity. So I think, I just have a strong suspicion that the reason those birds were taken from the nest, if they have been taken, I don't know whether that came to fruition. I mean, under lockdown, I mean, no one else was meant to be moving around the country, and all of a sudden, someone could move around to take some peregrines out of the nest. And I suspect, I mean, you might correct me, but I suspect that that's because, they're going to make a lot of money for someone, because people overseas will pay a lot of money for those sorts of birds. So I think the minute you get monetarization, you get lack of regulation, all of those sorts of things, then you get problems. But I've had that relationship with a bird. It's I have relationships with my dogs, but it's very different, very, very different indeed. There's no real comparison. The intensity is the same for me, but the way that you interact with a bird is nothing like you interact with a dog or anything else. So it's very, very intense. And I understand people want to maintain those. Would I ever go back to it? Well, I always used to say that, if I ever got a chance to retire, then I'd love a goshawk. I read T.H. White's The Goshawk when I was 12 or 13 or something. And that mad bird, that mad book. And then Mavrogodato's Hawk for the Bush was always one of my favorite Falconer's book, and E.B. Mitchell's Art and Practice of Hawking was my all-time favorite. The descriptions of that in the old days when they were catching those, migrating birds using shrikes in Holland, the Dutch stuff. And then even those descriptions which are unthinkable now of ringing flights with larks and merlins, So it's a bygone age, piece of history, but it was beautifully written in E.B. Mitchell's book. Would I go back to it? Well, I'd always sort of said if I retired, I'd love a goshawk, but I'm never going to retire. That's not going to happen. So I'm never going to get my goshawk. And I'm really fortunate this year. I've had a nest quite close to me, and I've been watching the youngsters. I've got 3 of them out there at the moment. I'm 59 years old. I get to see goshawk every day when I want to. I mean, if you'd have said that to me when I was 15, 16, 17, firstly, I'd never have believed you. And secondly, I'd have burst, It's just unthinkable. So I get to see them in the wild. I'm not sure I'd go back to keeping them,
It's weird. That's a transition I went through. As I say, I monitored birds of prey and worked with them in captivity. And then, I found that I got so much more enjoyment from seeing a peregrine or whatever the species was I was watching than working necessarily with them. I understand the advantages of some aspects of captivity, but I think you're right, really, with the commercialization. That's one of the reasons I got out of it. And one of the first things I did with Raptor Aid was stuck my head above the parapet regarding owls and poke and strokes and started banging the drum about that. And the problem was it nearly became all consuming, and I couldn't do any of the conservation and education stuff that I wanted to. So we might revisit that, but that's another commercialization aspect of it, which is a real shame. But good. Well, I think people have enjoyed hearing your thoughts on that. Some of my friends, anyway. Let's talk about TV, because I remember you from. I'm old enough to remember the really wild days. So the blonde hair and big hair and Terry Nutkins and Michaela and what have you. How did that come about? How did the TV come about?
Well, I left university and as sort of virtually unemployable obsessive ecologist, and I'd worked really, really hard, and I'd written up my badger study and everything else that I'd done. But I'd always had this sort of yearning to do art. I've got a studio out here. I'll go and make a mess on bits of board with paint. I've got to be doing something individually creative. Earlier today, I was taking photographs, or trying to take photographs. Weather turned. It's now gone back to blue sky. So there was, for me, it was always about, zoology art like this. And so when I left university, I was about to start a PhD on badgers, but I just about had it with badgers. So I dumped the PhD and then bought a camera. So I used to play in a punk rock band, sold all my gear and bought a camera. And because I thought that would be a fast track way to be, creative. I thought photography would be easy. It's a big mistake, of course. Because I hadn't trained to use any other media. And I got a load of lockups and started making sculptures and painting stuff and taking photos. And then in order to pay for that, I got a job as a camera assistant with someone who was making, wildlife films for the Bristol BBC's NHU, Natural History Unit.
Yeah. And
I worked as an assistant with him, and that paid for my Kodachrome and my. So I thought it was something interesting. I'll keep gazing around because I've got a view behind the camera here, and I'm trying to hoping something nice is going to fly by. And then I worked with him for about 3 years, and then I wanted to. I had a sort of materialistic goal at that time. There was something I really wanted to buy, and it was slipping out of my reach, and I was getting really frustrated and not getting a lot of work, and I had a job to go filming in Mexico, and I had to pull out at the last minute because I hadn't had the right inoculations at that time. So I had like 3 months booked up, and then all of a sudden 3 months cancelled. And I thought, I can't put up with this. I've got to make some money. So I went and did an audition for the Really Wild show. When in fact they'd finished the audition, so I had to sort of virtually demand one, and then do it. And then they didn't make up their mind. And eventually I was on the dole, and I spent the last bit of dole money on a train ticket to Bristol. Didn't have enough money for the taxi, so I walked from the station to the BBC. Because I'd been working as a cameraman on and off for them, I managed to get in the building, and then I found the office for where they were making the Really Wild show, where they were starting to set it up. And I went to see, and I walked up to the guy's desk and said, you're going to get, well, I won't tell you exactly what I said, because I was in my early 20s and spoke my mind even more frequently than I do now. And I basically, said to him, look, you're going to give me the job or not? Because if you're not, I've got other things to get on with. And he liked that. Mike Bainan, his name was. He's a really good guy, and he had some brilliant ideas, and he liked people that just sort of hit nails on heads. So he said, yeah, okay, then I'll give you the job. And that was it.
Good work. And then how long's it been now in TV? Sorry, I don't want to make you feel old now. But...
Well, that was 1985, and we did the first Really Wild show that winter of 85, 86. It was recorded, obviously, and not live. And I've been doing it ever since. I've never been out of work from that point of view.
There you go. 34 years odd then, because I'm an 85 baby, so there you go.
Just 34. Well, okay.
34. That makes you feel sorry. Obviously, this Spring Watch as well. We mentioned like Steve Roberts, and well done this year. It was everything. I really enjoyed it. In and out catching bits and everything I've seen on social media, people have raved about. Did you enjoy it this year? I know you've probably talked about this more.
I mean, I don't like things staying the same. I always like things if they change, and it needed to change. And this year the change was forced upon it. So we had a lot of technical, changes that we had to make and editorial and so on and so forth. I think the most important thing was getting the mood right at that point, and we seemed to hit that zeitgeist and people liked it. It was a very particular and peculiar time. I don't think we'd do that again successfully. Yeah. I think we've got to think about what we do next. But we did learn a lot of lessons, and I like change. A lot of people need to be forced to make change. I'm quite happy to tear things up and start again, but most people don't like doing that. So this was an opportunity to sort of get everyone to do something differently because they had no choice. So I did quite like that. Megs and I, have been locked down here, and so it was good to be working at home, although quite stressful because it was just us and two cameramen, so we had to do everything with no sort of assistance, as it were, CE rather than TE, TS.
It sounds like Steve Roberts whinging as well at the moment.
No, we're not. I'm not whinging. It was just, I did find it quite exhausting, to be quite honest with you. I mean, all the Zoom meetings and all that sort of stuff. I find Zoom quite challenging. Again, because I'm not normally used to looking at myself, and I'm not normally used to looking at other people. So the Zoom thing was just absolutely relentless for obvious reasons. It's the only way we could communicate to put anything together. So that was pretty tiring. But anyway, look, ultimately, I think, as I say, under a very particular and peculiar set of circumstances, it worked and people liked it. We also had some good science in this year, actually, because I normally have to fight really hard to get, I'm the one that behind the scenes that's, fighting for every scientific corner. I love new science, and we had quite a lot of that in there. I was really satisfied that that we hit that mark. You know, there were a few things I think we might have missed, but then under the circumstances, it was pretty tough. So yeah.
Well, I think all round, the feedback was, from everything I've seen, was really, really positive. And you know, even people commenting, someone's just commented tonight how good Megan was as well with you. People really like that. So yeah, good work, well done. I've had this. Someone's put a question up twice now. So, well, not two different people have asked the same thing. If you were to be a raptor for one day, it's a bit of a cheesy question, but if you were to be a raptor for one day, which one would it be?
Wow, my goodness, it's a hard one, isn't it? If we're broad about what we call raptors, so therefore, you know, we push the boundaries, because I don't think, you know, technically, obviously vultures aren't raptors, but
yeah.
Rappel's griffon, you know, is the highest flying bird in the world. Got so high up once over West Africa, it would have seen the curvature of the earth. That, you know, to do that without a spacesuit would be pretty cool. Also, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who'd been putting some food in his bird feeder, and a sparrowhawk had come through between him and the house, which was about 1 meter, and snatched a siskin. And he, you know, it's one of those things where you sort of blink and you thought, did that really happen? And, you know, like it's just a feather on the breeze to tell you that it wasn't a dream. So to be able to fly like a goshawk or sparrowhawk that fast through woodland, you know, like a fighter jet flying. I mean, fighter jets are pretty good at flying through the sky. They can't fly through woods, you know, without catastrophe. So, I mean, that would be pretty sensational. But then, you know, I love the sort of, I'm lucky, you know, I still see hobby frequently. All of that. Once jumped out of an aeroplane. I wanted to know what it was like to stoop at 200 miles an hour. So I did a tandem jump, and me and the parachutist sort of, rather than sort of stabilizing that sort of skydive position, we sort of went like that. And I had this little thing tied to my ankle to see how fast we went. And we hammered out of the sky. And so for a few minutes, it was, you know, I knew what it was like to be a peregrine falcon stooping.
Yeah.
And that was pretty sensational. When I landed, I just wanted to do it again. I wanted to be a peregrine over and over again. I suppose, I mean, ultimately, the birds that now, I don't see kestrels very much now because they've declined here, and we've got goshawks, and they seem to take quite a few things out. So I'd go for sparrowhawk, and then I'd go for male. A little male sparrowhawk's one of the most beautiful birds in the world. And when you see them sort of, as they do here, just bending around this cottage, you know, and it's just phenomenal, you know.
Yeah. No, we had a sparrowhawk the other day on the farm here, right in front of me. I was just opening the door to let the dogs out, in the corner of my eye, and it zipped, this little musket, landed on the gravel. It just pulled out of trying to catch something, and then in the blink of an eye, was gone into the woods, and they're incredible. But I don't know. Well, considering you've got to be it for a day and you picked a vulture first, that's a pretty icky one, I think, really. I don't know whether I'd want to be a vulture sticking my head in something's orifice of somewhere.
But you could soar up to like whatever it was, like 14,000 feet, and just sort of, you know, hang out at high altitude of your own volition. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. They cope with the thin air, they cope with the, you know, in terms of their respiratory and their aeronautic capabilities. I mean, vultures, big vultures are just staggering. I'm not really birds of prey, of course, but, you know, staggering animals. But yeah, no, okay, I'd go sparrowhawk, and, you know, tough call between goss and that, but male sparrowhawk.
Fair enough. I'd probably, for me, it'd probably be, as you said, I always said peregrine, but my favourite in the UK is hobby. So I think, imagine being a hobby chasing a swift or a swallow, or even catching a dragonfly on the wing bends my head a bit. So yeah.
Hey, what about those Gaia falcons that spend the winter roosting on icebergs out in the North Atlantic? You know, so they're out there in pretty much almost 24 hours of darkness on an iceberg hunting sea ducks. I mean, that's like something out of Mary Shelley. That's that's Frankenstein stroke Dracula land, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's so far out. Can you imagine, you know, being a bird of prey on a floating piece of ice in the North Atlantic, scoffing sea ducks? I mean, it's just outrageous. I could do a bit of that. But I could only do it if I was one of the Greenland ones. I wouldn't want to be an Icelandic grey one. I'd have to be a pure white.
Pure white.
I'd have to be one of those pure white fancy ones.
Yeah, I don't know. I still think I'd be. I like J. Falcons, but yeah, a peregrine. I don't think you can be a female peregrine. You'll like this story, Chris. I run a peregrine watch in our local city, and you've probably heard about the Exeter peregrines that bash buzzards. Well, I had it happen in front of my very eyes last year on the peregrine watch, and several volunteers. So they went screaming off the tower, they nest, buzzard in the distance, and this poor. You know, it's nature, and I'm fully aware, red in tooth and claw, but this poor buzzard was done all ends up, and rather than fly in the opposite way, and it was almost like watching a movie, you wanted to shout, fly the other way. It kept coming closer and closer to the shot tower, and then of course all hell broke loose, and it was that tandem attack from male and female, and they folded it up like a I don't know what, a paper bag in the air, and it fell into the street right next to us. And I've never seen anything. I've seen a lot of bird of prey stuff. I've never seen anything like that. And the female did all the damage. The male was sort of like, yeah, we'll get you. And then she came in, and now the buzzard's in my freezer, which is a bit weird, but there you go. So yeah, it's not much beats a female peregrine, I don't think.
No. In terms of the breadth of their shoulders, the size of their feet, they're so imposing when you see one perched, and you get the sort of proportions of it. You know, they're like that wide, you know. And then there's that beautiful back shape with the sort of square shoulders and the wings go in. And then all of a sudden, these ridiculously sized feet. The feet are way too big for the bird, you know. So, yeah, no, they're impressive. They are impressive. But the dainty little sparrowhawk living on the edge, it's got to eat twice a day. It's got to kill 2 blue tits a day, or it's dust, you know. And it's got to do it at hyper speed through woodland. Just amazing, you know.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, we'll leave that one. We had another chap on, Scott Mason, did a Q&A for us. He runs a company out in Spain. He used to be based in Nepal doing parahawkings. So he said to you, if you want to come flying with vultures, you know, you can sit on Scott's crotch, and yeah, he'll take you tandem paragliding. There's an offer for you.
There's an offer. There was a guy called Pennyquick, and he was a scientist in South Africa, did a lot of early work with that, with vultures, and also white storks and pelicans as well. And I remember looking at some of his film. I'm just going back some time now. It was film probably, and not even tape or digital. And yeah, absolutely remarkable. I mean, it's astonishing because they were so close, and he got right up in the thermals with all of these birds. It was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You can do that. I think Yolo's been and done that, because yeah.
Has he done it?
I seem to remember a joke story about Yolo tipping the full pouch of meat into his crotch. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but there was a bit of panic mid-air anyway with that. But I knowing Yolo, he probably did it on purpose. But there you go. Say no more. Right, you've mentioned way back now that you're never going to retire. So we've got to talk about campaigning and the work you do with Mark and Ruth and Wild Justice. Was that a natural progression then, just listening to you talk about, you know, going in for the really wild show and, you know, saying, am I going to get a job or not? Was it this sort of, you're always going to walk into that sort of line of work? You're not going to, you know, just stick to the day job of television presenting and being a general naturalist?
The day job's great, and I'm very, very fortunate to have that job. You know, I enjoy most of it. You know, the downsides are the same as every downsides in everyone else's life. You know, it's the travel, you know, the logistics, the mundane. But apart from that, I'm very fortunate to have that, you know, the job that I do. Although it isn't just TV, I spend probably more time not doing TV, doing other things. But ultimately, you know, the reason I do it, I never wanted to be or needed to be on TV. You know, I needed to make the world a better place for wildlife. So, you know, TV helps facilitate that, which is great. So there's a strong vocational reason for me to pursue that profession, because I need to try and, as much as everyone else is trying to, sort this mess out. And it is a mess. It's a massive mess. And it's not a question of asking any longer, to get that mess sorted. It's a question of having to demand it or do something about it. And so therefore, the idea of sort of, going home and putting your feet up, putting your slippers on, counting the, what goes into the bank is an anathema to me. It's just not about that at all. For me, it's about, tonight I've been doing HS2. We're about to launch into hen harriers next week. That's what it's really about. And you have to appreciate that, when I got into birds, it was 1970. We've lost 90 million birds from the UK countryside since 1970. On my watch, most habitats and monitored species in the UK have gone into critical decline. I've witnessed species extinction. It's easy to say, and I'd find it difficult to argue against the fact that as a conservationist, I've been a failure. I've failed to achieve the things that I aspired to do. And that's, I think, because in the past we relied upon other people to get things done. We thought they'd do the right thing. We thought they'd summon the right amount of energy. We thought they'd say the right thing to the right people. But none of them were getting out of bed. They were just sleeping on the watch. So now we've woken up to that. There's no alternative that we set the alarm clock and we get up and we fight every fight. And it's becoming a fight because people don't want to change their minds quickly. That's the downside. The human animal is a remarkably intelligent, resourceful, adaptable. It's a great organism, the human, but it can't change its mind quick. And when you point out to people that they're doing something wrong that's no longer compatible with the way that we need to think about doing things now, and they will just want to hang on to what they were doing yesterday because they've always done it. It doesn't cut any ice with me. I'm sorry, I'm interested in today and tomorrow. Yesterday's in history, great, that can inform what we do today and tomorrow, but it's like traditions. If a tradition doesn't have any contemporary relevance, it's redundant as far as I'm concerned. It's like fox hunting. There is no contemporary relevance for fox hunting. It's utterly abhorrent. It's been abhorrent for ages. There's no possible reason to be able to justify that in the 21st century. Let's end it. We've ended slavery. We're fighting racism. We need to fight against that sort of animal abuse, wild animal abuse in that sense. We need to do it with the same amount of fervor and gusto as we're fighting for all of these things, because, racism is, cannot be tolerated. We thought it was getting fixed. I remember in the 60s watching all that stuff when there were, human rights, demonstrations, particularly in the United States. I remember watching that on Panorama, certainly through into the 70s around the Vietnam War and all that sort of stuff. And then you just go into some sort of safe little bubble where you think, oh yeah, okay, well, all the progress has been made. Well, no, it hasn't. And it's the same when it comes to conservation. We had Save the Tiger, we have Save the Whale, we had all that stuff kicking off in the 70s. We had Greenpeace that came in a bit more, thankfully, heavy-handed later on. But ultimately, we've lost. Read the State of Nature report. Our landscape in the UK is essentially going to hell in a handcart, and so is that of the global environment. So, when we think about bigger picture stuff, in 2008, the Committee on Climate Change said that, that we should be really worried about a 4-degree centigrade rise in global temperature. And then last week, they told the government they should prepare for that. Well, that's like preparing for the ultimate apocalypse. That's millions and billions of people dying. In order to try and cope with it, that's whole ecosystems being destroyed. That's terminal. And we know it. And there's no excuse, therefore, if we know that that's, can't be countenanced, and we know that we've got solutions, we've got to implement them. Yeah. But of course, when we try to do that, we meet resistance from people who've got vested interest, or they just can't change their minds, and that's why we get involved in fracas.
Does it frustrate you? Because obviously, and again, talking about from the sort of when you started at the beginning of this chat, and you published papers before you were 17. Does it annoy you then when people don't don't read the detail in what you're trying to achieve, and they just sling mud and you know, counteract it with you know, all sorts of crap, basically. Does that frustrate you, or is it sort of like, well, I've got to take that this is part of the course because that's
part of the process. It's just part of the process. We're asking people to change their minds more quickly than they're able to do so or want to do so, and as a consequence of that, when they're in a corner and it begins to dawn on them that, you know, that they're losing, then they just lash out. That's what unfortunately some humans do. And so from my point of view, I just see it as part of the process. You know, it's, if anything, it just fuels me and makes me want to try harder. You know, I mean, I think there were some of the things that have happened over the last, you know, 4 or 5 years, maybe longer, of you know, some of the approaches taken by the people who have different opinions than mine have been entirely counterproductive from their point of view, because basically they've just poured fuel on my fire. You know, they should have thought about it, but they didn't, because they don't think sometimes. And that's the difference between the way that they operate and the way that Wild Justice operates. We do think, we never react. You know, we always consider everything. We talk about everything. We let it. We wait and think and mull and pontificate. Sometimes not for long, if we don't have long, but we never knee jerk. You know, and we know where we come from, and where we come from is a firm foundation of science and an ethical and moral right in terms of, you know, where we stand. So we feel strong because we, you know, we're in a good place to present our argument in order to change things to the way that we feel they ought to be. And that's when you know, I don't know, it's like you know, when they used to go to the Crusades and they had God on their side and their sword in their scabbard and all that sort of stuff. It's and they felt so empowered, I imagine, to do that. I was watching a thing about and reading about the Crusades recently and wondering what motivated people to make those journeys and do that stuff, you know. And it was that compulsion that compulsion that they were right. And I'm not comparing us to those crusaders in any political or historical sense, but you know, we have a real sense of justice, and we're fed up with people getting away with things that they shouldn't be getting away with, because they're not acceptable morally, ethically, or in environmental or conservation terms. So we've got to change it. And if no one else, you know, I mean, let's face it, Wild Justice came into being because no one else was doing what we're doing. There was a vacant niche.
Yeah.
And so we had to do something.
What sort of, I normally say that the last question is about advice. What piece of advice would you give? But just what we're talking about now, what sort of advice would you give to the general fighter, the not necessarily conservationist, but someone that's watching this, that's got an active interest in the natural world, a real concern, you know, it could be anything, you know, the pictures we've just seen of the beaches in Bournemouth and stuff like that, or, you know, the pheasant shooting industry, fox hunting. What sort of advice would you give to someone that feels, you know, this is hard, this is scary?
Well, it's all about, really, you know, from my perspective, it's all about recognizing your own self-empowerment. It's about knowing that you can make a difference, that you do have a voice, that you must exercise that voice, that you've got to, you know, stop moaning and start doing. You know, you've got to get up when everyone else is lying down, you know, and ultimately, as I always say, you know, you've got to shout above the noise. There's so much noise out there. You know, we turn on the news and what we get is noise. There's so much noise now, we can't actually see or hear what's right or wrong anymore, because that's what they've done. They've buried us with their noise. Well, if you take the time and you've got the mindset, you can see through that, and you can see what's right and what's wrong, and what's good and bad, and what you should and shouldn't do. And as a consequence of that, you know, you need to be vocal about it. And I think that, unfortunately, I think that there's a we're in a strange place. We've got more of the answers than we've ever had before because we've been collecting data of all kinds, more than we've had before. We've got more technology than we've ever had before, and technology allows us to develop solutions to some of those problems that we've got the data to prove that they exist. But at the same time, we've got probably the worst global crop of decision makers that you could have ever imagined. I mean, I know there's been pretty bad times in even recent history. If you consider the last 100 years, there's been pretty bad times. But we're in a globally a really bad place with some really bad people. And, you know, ultimately, therefore, we have to do it ourselves. You can either sit back and say, well, someone voted for them, so that's just the way it is. Nice swallows going over. But or you can get up and make a difference, and that's what you've got to do. I don't want to sit back and watch the world burn because Boris, Bolsonaro, and Trump just want to fill their boots. It's not going to happen, you know. Yeah. So I think that we've all got to realise that we've got to find our own pitch. There were some people who will want to just, you know, do that passively. There were some people who will want to do it more forthrightly. But ultimately, if we don't exercise our informed voices in a democratic and peaceful way at some stage in the next 5 or 10 years, then I think we're doomed. It's that simple, you know. When you've got people who are flagrantly ignoring the science, you know, in order to perpetuate their short-term greed, you're in trouble. And you've basically got to drown them out. You've got to shout above their noise. And that's what we're going to have to do. And I think now, after Corona, what Corona proved was, you know, amongst the plethora of things that it's done bad to us, what it proved was that when you consider your mind, take your mind back more than a year to April, when people like me were on the streets of London doing Extinction Rebellion. You know, climate change was an existential thing. It was something that we couldn't possibly deal with. The idea of grounding all the world's aircraft in order to protect the climate, nonsense. The idea of stopping all the cars in the cities to prevent respiratory death, problems, killing 30,000 people a year in the UK, absolute nonsense. You know, all of these things were impossible. They're unthinkable. But then all of a sudden, we do them. We do them because we have to. Because again, you know, the human species, when it has to do something, does it. You know, we are inherent survivors. We've overcome every test that's been chucked at us throughout the course of history, and we will overcome Corona at a cost. We will overcome it. But what I'm worried about at the moment is that, you know, the cost that we've really got to address is climate change and biodiversity loss. But what Corona has proved is that when we need to, we can. So there's no excuses anymore. Don't tell me that we can't fix those problems. We can. We just fixed something. You know, we haven't fixed it completely, unfortunately, but we're fixing it as best we possibly can under a panic situation. You know, some good, some bad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I find it frustrating, you know, talking about coronavirus and the effect it's had, in the sense of, you look at those images that are used where you can't see the end of the Great Wall of China. Coronavirus comes about, and all of a sudden you can't see the Taj Mahal right in front of you, and then the smoke. And you think, how that one picture, how can it be any more obvious that, you know, this can't be good? What we've been doing, but yeah.
Well, look, what it's proved is that, you know, our normal was abjectly abnormal. You know, our business was essentially bad business, you know, and it's buzzard. Oh, so hoping for Goshawk flyby. And then I could have bragged that of all the people you've had on live, I could have had Goshawk, and it was a buzzard. Can you believe it? Come on, buzzard. Anyway, whatever. At least I'm honest. So, but I mean, you know, the key thing is we don't want to go back there, and yet that's what they want us to do. They want us to go straight back into doing what we did before, because there's a conspicuous lack of imagination, and there's a conspicuous, you know, desire just to get their hands back in the pie. And the pie needs to be baked a different way. There's plenty of way for people to find employment, have a healthy and sustainable, future for them and their families. But it needs a rethink. It needs rethinking, retraining, and everything, and that requires total support from everyone. And it's a global issue. We're one species with one problem at one time, and if we don't make one difference, then we're one doomed.
We're doomed. Yeah, I agree. I find, yeah, it's almost like it's that. One of the other things I struggle with is the lack of empathy a lot of the time with the natural world. That there's, we're on two different levels. There's us and the natural world. When it couldn't, I don't need to tell you this, or most people probably watching this. It couldn't be any further the truth, and that sometimes, frustrates me. But there we go. I'm just conscious. I'm just watching the time. I know some people had asked about this, and going back to wild justice, and I can't possibly, we haven't even talked about hen harriers, and there's lots of stuff out there in the press on hen harriers at the moment. But I just wanted to touch on, if we take the legal action that's taking place with pheasant shooting at the moment, does it? How do you get round? Does it annoy you again, or if you're probably used to it, so I'm answering my own question. When people are hell bent on not really listening to the facts, and they can't see the wood from the trees, how do we get around that? Is it going to be always about legal challenges, or again, someone's asked, is there other ways that they can support? Because a lot of the time I find that people want to know what they can do. I know we've just talked about that in conservation as a whole, but specifically, I get asked a lot, well, what can I do in that specific area? So take pheasant shooting, for instance, and the legal take, or fox hunting.
Well, I think that you've got to find avenues for you to find that voice that I was speaking about. I mean, and wild justice is one of those avenues. We provide the opportunity to do our bit, which is the legal side. There are other people doing other things, of course, campaigning, in the same direction, but using different methods. That's good, actually. So there's not so much overlap. But, sometimes it is signing a petition. We launched a petition to ban driven grouse shooting, the third one that we've done, and it got more than 100,000 signatures. Next week, the results of that petition will be publicised. So I probably don't want to say too much. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say any more about it than that at the moment. But anyway, next week, the result of those people having signed that will become public. So that's good. And then wild justice, we work with a great team of lawyers. And we're very considered about the cases that we take. There's plenty more cases that we'd like to, but if they don't hold water, even if they're right, even if they're without any ambiguity, they're right. If they don't hold legal water, we're not taking them. I can't waste people's money. And ultimately, we're publicly funded. We crowdfund, people give us money. They trust us to make sure that money's well spent. And therefore, it needs to be spent on cases we don't always have to win, I have to say. It's not always about winning. It's not about standing outside the court with a smile on your face. It's sometimes about generating, some of that noise that I mentioned, to drown out the other stuff. But it's also about getting people to think. And, some of the things that we've done with general licenses and, the 50 million perhaps non-native birds which are released into the UK to be shot every year, are to get people to think, to get DEFRA to think, to get Natural England to think, to get the birders of the UK to think. Because when I grew up, pheasants and red-legged partridges, they were just part of the bird fauna. And that was in the 70s, when there was nowhere near the number being released that there are now. And like we go back to our point about falconry, this is about commercialization. This is about lack of regulation. And the point is that when it comes to releasing these birds, they've been getting away with not understanding what the impact is. And when you think about it, when you drill down, all that wild justice has done is asked the regulatory body, DEFRA, Natural England, to find out what impact releasing 50 million non-native birds, the largest avian biomass, the largest single species biomass of any UK animal, non-native pheasants, basically, at the end of summer, has on our ecology. Because we, as scientists, don't believe that it has no impact at all. It's improbable that it doesn't have an impact. So all we've done, nothing more, is ask people to investigate that impact so that we can make an informed decision. And that's exactly what we did when it came to general licenses. We were concerned about the casual killing of birds because people were going out and shooting things because they could, not because they needed to. And at no point in that action did we want to damage anyone's interest in terms of their ability to control what they call pest species and so on and so forth. We just wanted people to think that is it right that they can go out and shoot jays? What harm do jays actually do? What harm do rooks actually do? What harm do jackdaws actually do? And the collared doves, now a species in decline, what harm do they actually do? Yeah. And I just think these are perfectly valid questions. So we're just raising questions for people to think about. And I think that thinking, is underrated. Drinking is overrated. And I think that therefore bodies like Wild Justice are there to get people to think, and whether they're you and I, or whether they're government bodies or statutory bodies or NGOs, that's what it's about. So I think that if you agree or you come up, you identify your own injustice which is damaging to the environment and to the species that live in it, then you need to tell people about that. We need to share that as a community. We need to collectively build our strength. We need to make sure that we exercise our fortitude of numbers and so forth in order to effect change. And we want to do it. We're not bludgeoning anyone. We want to do it in a democratic and a peaceful way. That's why we have government petitions. That's why we take legal action through the courts, which is justice, right and wrong, measured on the scales and all that stuff. And we'll continue to plug away at that. And I think that's what you've got to do. Do we think at any point that this is going to be and something's going to change? No, unfortunately not. But when you think about, let's think about the hen harrier issue. Mark's, started that, and then I came on board, and Ruth as well a few years ago now. But in the last 10 years, look at what's happened to the so-called glorious 12th of the grouse shooting season. There were as many articles published in UK newspapers and news sites online about the negative aspects of grouse shooting as there are the positive, and so again, collective awareness has grown. We've managed to identify a plethora of reasons why driven grouse shooting is not a good idea, and and we've disseminated that information in a way which is truthfully, so that people understand it and they're on board. And they recognize that this is not something that we should be continuing to do. It's something which should be consigned to, history, like so many of the other things that we did incorrectly.
Well, again, that goes back to traditions, doesn't it? And always being able to. I think it's important that you should always be able to look at what you do and always question it, whatever you do in life, in the sense of review it and say, well, I'm doing the right thing. But as humans, we don't like seeing faults, do we? Certainly not in ourselves or something that we do. So it's hard work.
No, but it's not just about that, though, is it? Remember, in the case of like pheasants and grouse, it's because there was never any regulation, because they've been getting away with it. It's now become big money. And that's, again, goes back to what we were saying earlier. That's another problem now. So you're not only fighting against people's ethics, you're fighting against their collective financial interest in perpetuating that. And because it's worth a lot of money, then they can be quite forceful in their argument and their campaigning. And I think that the other thing that's interesting about conducting these sorts of this sort of work at the moment is that we live in the era of fake news. And the key thing is, I go to my bed at night knowing that when it comes to campaigning, I've told the truth as I know the truth, and bear in mind that, things change, but as I know the truth every single night. I sleep I don't sleep very much, actually. When I finally get to sleep, when it comes to campaigning, my conscience is clear. We don't lie. We don't have to lie, because we don't have to lie about the fact that hen howies are being slaughtered on grouse moors, because you've all read the news, that's been coming out in the last month. You know, there's no, as I say, there's no ambiguity about that. So, you know, we can fight, you know, the true fight. And the difference is that we're now fighting in an age where people can just lie about stuff and make stuff up, and they do, and you read it all the whole time. Sometimes it makes you laugh, sometimes it makes you angry, sometimes it makes you cry, but whatever, it makes you more motivated and more determined to win out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got a lot. Yeah, there's loads of comments coming through, but I'm just conscious of time. I don't want to. Yeah, keep going. I could talk all night, Chris, but I know you've got lots of other things to get on with. So I'm going to draw it to a close.
A sleeping poodle like a metre away that had an operation yesterday that's looking like it needs a cuddle.
Oh, well, I'm glad that the interview managed to put the dog to sleep, send the dog to sleep.
You didn't see what was going on behind the camera. They were racing around the garden, you know, and then they've dug an enormous hole over there. I don't know what they were after, probably a bank hole. And in terms of bird lists this evening, so I've had nice swallow fly over, which was quite good. We're a little bit early for woodcock. What's been most exciting about the lockdown here, I rent this farm in the New Forest, and is that we've had nightjar every night chirring close to us, because the fields have all not been grazed this year or cut, and so hello, here's one. I'm going to show you one now. Oh, look at this. There we are. Now you'll say that that's not as good as a female peregrine, you know, and it can't stoop as fast. It's not quite as predatory, but
well, I'm a dog man, but I haven't got my dog. I've got wire-haired dashhound, so they I don't know whether they supersede poodles. So yeah,
I call them woolly torpedoes.
Well, I can't. He's got a bent nose as well, so he can only sniff one way. So yeah, but I can't have him in the same room because he goes berserk. He's just carnage. But anyway, there we go. Dogs. Well, it's lovely to meet one of the poodles as well.
Of Sid and Nancy fame. So I was just going through my list. Goldfinch went over. There was greenfinch singing earlier. Blackbird's been around. The wrens I've been watching because they've got a little nest over there. But the only bird of prey that deigned to fly by was the buzzard, common buzzard. So it could have been quite exotic, but anyway, there we go.
Well, that was Colin Tubbs flying past, to keep an eye on you. Exactly.
Top bloke.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you very much for your time. It's been a real privilege to have you on. Thank you for persevering with me and putting up with me. So it's been great.
Not at all. Thank you for the invitation, and it's great to I'm very fortunate to follow in some far greater footsteps. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants when I talk to people like Mark and Ruth and Steve, of course, who's a brilliant ornithologist. They're really good people.
The Welsh wizard, as I call him. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's a wizard when it comes to birds of prey. He knows his stuff.
All right. Cheers, Chris. Thank you.
All right. Good night.